I'm now joined by the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor under President Obama, Susan Rice. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Great to be with you, Brian.
So we are right now watching the fallout from Signalgate 2.0, where we found out that there was a Signal chat that not only included the editor of The Atlantic, but a second Signal chat where Pete Hegseth had included such need-to-know folks like his wife, his brother, and his personal attorney. I have to ask first and foremost, what would have happened if something analogous had occurred during the Obama administration?
The Secretary of Defense would have been fired in a heartbeat after the first outrageous revelation of Signalgate 1.0, along with many of the others. And that's because, Brian, they were conducting sensitive deliberations about whether and when and how to engage in military action against a foreign adversary on an unsecure, non-governmental system. And then Hegseth took the outrage to a whole new level by putting sensitive, classified operational details into, now we know, both chats, one among the National Security Council principals or cabinet level secretaries, and then this new one that we've just learned about, which is even more outrageous, with members of his family and personal advisors. This is a huge breach of national security. It puts our men and women in uniform at risk because these conversations occurred on Signal, a commercial application, and we now know on Hegseth's personal cell phone, which can easily be hacked and is certainly being monitored by our most sophisticated foreign adversaries.
So can you dig into that bit a little bit? Because that's what interests me, because there's a lot of folks who say, there has been a lot of disparagement of Signal, and Signal in and of itself is a secured app. But what does it mean, for example, that he uses his personal device, and how can that make even a secure app like Signal that much more unsecure?
Well, first of all, Signal is end-to-end encrypted, which makes it, for a commercial application, pretty strong. But it is not anything like the kind of encryption that we utilize in the national security agencies for communications that involve classified information, which this clearly is. And so there's no comparison. People like to use Signal, and it's certainly better than nothing, but it is not the equivalent of a classified system. Point one. Point two is that in particular, when you are using Signal on a cell phone, and especially a non-government issued cell phone, which our adversaries are certain to take an interest in. Look, as a former national security advisor to this day, I expect that the Chinese and the Russians and the Saudis and perhaps the Israelis and maybe the Iranians are in my cell phone. And they are still curious about what I say and do. And I'm mindful of that as I conduct my business. Any national security official needs to expect that their phone can easily be compromised, because that is the capacity that we know exists. Remember, I don't know if you recall, Brian, just as one example, the software called Pegasus that the Israelis utilized against actually former Obama administration officials and many others. This is an app. This is software that can be purchased and utilized to infect unwittingly the phones of people around the world. And so, Secretary Hegseth and every member of the National Security Council Principals Committee ought to know better. And in any case, they're dissembling, because that information was clearly, undoubtedly classified. Military operational details are by definition classified. Deliberations about whether to conduct a military strike on an adversary are inherently classified. So here they are engaging recklessly in classified discussions over unsecure commercial applications.
And so given this egregious recklessness, what do you make of the fact that when pressed on this issue just a few days ago on Easter Sunday, Trump cast off this idea that he wouldn't back Pete Hegseth? Caroline Leavitt said the same thing, that everyone is really throwing their weight behind Pete Hegseth, really because they've kind of perverted this whole issue to be just, oh, the liberal media and the radical leftists are trying to find any way to undermine our Donald Trump's duly appointed cabinet, and so any criticism of him has to be cast off.
Well, any criticism of the king has to be cast off. I mean, this is ridiculous. Donald Trump ran in 2016 on what he considered, in terms of Hillary Clinton's email server, to be the biggest breach of classified information in the history of the republic. And here his own team is repeatedly caught doing much, much worse. And the rules apparently don't apply to Trump and to his people. They only apply to his adversaries. And that is indicative of a fundamental problem we're facing, which is that Trump is governing as if he were a monarch, and everybody is subservient to him. And anybody who criticizes or questions the actions or behavior of his team or himself are inherently the enemies. And this is an extremely dangerous situation. But, this is how they roll. They're full of bluster. They're full of, antagonism against their adversaries as a way to distract and deflect. But the reality is Hegseth compromised national security repeatedly. He is utterly irresponsible and reckless. He never should have been in that job in the first place. He was completely unqualified, and it's past time that he go.
What do you make of the fact that just this past weekend it was said on Fox News that Pete Hegseth is going up against the entire Pentagon, and that struck me because that means that we're looking at a situation where either the entire U.S. military is part of this elusive, nebulous deep state, and Pete Hegseth is the only virtuous one, or it's just Pete Hegseth that's the problem here, and that's the reason he is the target of so much ire at the hands of the folks who compose the leadership of the U.S. military.
Well, this is a really interesting and important point. And every time a revelation is released in the public domain, the reaction from the president and the White House and from Hegseth these are just disgruntled DOD employees who've been fired and they're getting their revenge. Well, no, these are Hegseth's personal cronies that have been with him for 10 years, that he brought with him to the Pentagon, who served loyally with him, who claim to respect him and like him, who are coming out and saying, first of all, we were fired for no cause. And secondly, the Pentagon is in utter and complete disarray and chaos. And here's the really serious point, Brian. We had the former spokesperson of the Pentagon, a loyalist to Trump and to Hegseth, write in Politico that the department is an absolute, complete train wreck, and that it is dangerous for national security and it is not serving the President of the United States. Today, and the New York Times is reporting, that basic, paper processes in the Pentagon for decision-making are falling apart. A critical memo that required Hegseth's decision on missile defense was rushed to completion and then sat on his desk for 3 weeks, with the White House calling every day asking for where it is. This is a serious problem that undermines our national security and our military readiness. When the head of the Pentagon and those around him are in complete chaos and disarray, it's an invitation to our adversaries to take advantage of that chaos.
And so just politically speaking, I mean, we've seen the extent to which Republicans were able to weaponize their attacks against Hillary Clinton for, other national security issues, for carelessness with national security information, using a private email server, and the mileage that they got from that. And now we're seeing this Signalgate story, which is objectively worse, and the ways in which Pete Hegseth and the rest of the national security apparatus in the federal government has operated with such recklessness on numerous occasions, and like you said, the impacts that's going to have in terms of what our adversaries are going to be able to do and what they likely have access to already. And yet the fact is that because we don't have a media ecosystem that is anywhere near as robust as what they have on the right, this story will have maybe a few weeks of attention on it before we go to the next thing. And so what do you make of the fact that there is that glaring asymmetry where we could talk for years about Hillary Clinton's emails, and yet a few weeks for something that is objectively worse, but because the perpetrators are Republicans, suddenly it doesn't stick in the same way that Democrats do?
Well, I think we got to look at why that is, right? First of all, it is not the responsibility of progressive media. It's the responsibility of all responsible media to shine a spotlight on such an egregious breach of national security, which is repeated time and time again. It's the responsibility of Congress to investigate and to take this issue as seriously as it deserves. Unfortunately, we seem to have a bunch of leaders in Congress on the Republican side that control the House and the Senate that are hear no evil, see no evil, unless it applies to their political adversaries. And then we have Trump with his, crisis a day, chaos inducing, world disrupting, quasi excuse for leadership, throwing spaghetti at the wall every day and everybody's chasing it. So all of those things contribute, but it is the responsibility of the men and women of this country, the citizens of this country, and certainly the people in our who are sacrificing at great cost to serve our nation in uniform, to stand up and say collectively, we deserve better from the leaders of our national security team, and certainly from the Secretary of Defense. He came into office claiming, well, we're going to restore accountability to the military. And he is the least accountable, most irresponsible person in his personal behavior. And now we're seeing that replicated in his leadership of the Pentagon.
I just got to ask with regard to Hegseth, this is somebody who has predicated so much of his identity on his opposition, hostility to DEI. Can you speak about the fact that this is somebody who has spent so much time attacking DEI, and yet his qualifications and his actual performance in office, the ways in which what we would give for somebody who was in office as a DEI hire relative to what we have now with Pete Hegseth?
Well, if you're a white male Christian cisgender macho MAGA man, you can be as dumb as a rock and be deemed qualified to serve as Secretary of Defense. That's apparently what we've learned from this episode. But let's also be clear, there's a serious point here. DEI has been used as a slur to suggest that anybody who might be a woman, might be a person of color, might be a religious minority, might have a disability, might be a religious minority, might be a veteran or of Native descent, anybody who has benefited in any way, shape, or form from the notion that we all should be treated equally and that we should be viewed on the basis of our merits and not discounted because we happen to be a woman or happen to be a person of color. Anybody who fits the mold of somebody who is not a white Christian cisgender male is by definition in this administration deemed inferior. That is the vast majority, Brian, of the people in this country are deemed inferior by this notion that DEI has somehow infected our meritocracy. The opposite is true. We had a meritocracy where people who had qualifications, experience, and capability and intelligence could rise to positions of leadership on the basis of merit, even if they were a woman, even if they were a person of color, even if they were LGBTQ, even if they had a disability, even if they were Jewish or Muslim or something other than Christian. And this administration has turned that on its head under the guise of civil rights. And it is having real, very negative implications for our military and our national security. The mass firing of women 4-star and 3-star flag officers, of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others who are people of color, simply because it appears they are women or people of color, is really quite outrageous. And what that does to the force, the all-volunteer force, which is substantially made up of people of color and women, is to chill recruitment, to erode retention and readiness, and put at risk the quality and the long-term health of our military force.
Perfectly put. Let's finish off with this, and I'm loath to ask you about horse race stuff or even to get in the head of folks who work in the Trump administration. But do you presume, using your best judgment, that Pete Hegseth will make it much further, given the scandals that he's engrossed in right now, or is that a positive in this administration? And the more trouble you get yourself into, the deeper you are, the more deeply entrenched you are in the good graces of a lawless president.
Brian, I'm not going to make a prediction. I can't get in these people's heads. There's nothing about them that I can understand or divine. What I can say is, as a career national security and professional and public servant, that had that sort of behavior occurred in any of the administrations that I've served in, the Secretary of Defense and others would not still be in their roles. They have done enormous damage to national security. They have compromised classified information. They showed reckless disregard for the safety and security of our men and women in uniform who are in a combat operation. I can't think of anything more worthy of consequences than what we've seen of late.
Well, we'll leave it there. Susan Rice, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you.